we are also following the latest developments in the 2020 Georgia election interference case. A federal judge is asking Fulton County prosecutors and Mark Meadows' defense attorneys to file additional arguments as part of the former White House chief of staff's efforts to get his Georgia criminal case moved from state to federal court. CNN Justice correspondent Jessica Schneider is covering the story. So, Jessica, what more information is the judge now asking for, and what's the timeline?
Yeah, Alex, so this federal judge is asking for more briefing, and that really indicates here that this judge will not make a decision on whether Mark Meadows can remove his case to federal court anytime before Friday. That's because all the briefing on this issue is due Thursday evening. So the federal judge is asking here both sides. He's asking this question. He's saying because Mark Meadows is charged with 2 counts, one of them being that racketeering conspiracy charge that actually consists of several different overt acts, the judge is saying, well, if just one of those overt acts falls under the umbrella of Meadows as a federal officer, does that alone mean that Mark Meadows can remove his case to federal court? So really, that would be a win for Mark Meadows if it only took one act under RICO to let him move it to federal court. They're going to have briefing on this, and then the judge will take that into consideration. But it's an interesting legal question that this judge is confronting, Alex.
Yeah, it certainly is. And Jessica, there was also a new filing today from the Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this all relates to how quickly this trial might happen and if this trial could get splintered among the 19 defendants. So Fani Willis is pointing to one of Trump's campaign lawyers, Kenneth Chesebro. He has asked for a speedy trial. The judge has actually already set a trial date of October 23rd for him. Now Fani Willis is saying, wait, hold up, Judge. Are you already severing or separating Chesebro's case from the other 18 defendants, including the former president? She said, if that's what you're trying to do, if you're trying to already separate this case, we want to do a hearing on this. We want to actually argue this issue because remember, Fani Willis really has this goal of trying all 19 defendants in this RICO case together. And if these defendants are already splintering off, as we've seen here, she at least wants a hearing on it to discuss this issue. But Alex, it really does just show how difficult it is to try a RICO case, especially with 19 different defendants, all that have their own interests. We're seeing Mark Meadows trying to get his removed. So we're seeing the splintering already happen, and we've only heard from a few defendants so far.
All right, Jessica Schneider, thank you very much for that report. For more on this story, I'm joined now by CNN legal analysts Elie Honig and Jennifer Rogers. They are both former federal prosecutors. Thank you both for joining us. Elie, I want to ask you first about what Jessica was just talking about. Is this a reasonable request from Fani Willis to try all 19 defendants in this case at the same time in October?
No, Alex, and I don't believe that Fani Willis thinks it's a reasonable request. Here's the way this works. The right to a speedy trial belongs to the defendant, not to the prosecutor here. So if the defendant wants to insist on the right to a speedy trial, as Mr. Chesebro and Sidney Powell have done, then yes, you have the right to be tried under Georgia law, in this case, by November. But the prosecutor cannot force people who are unwilling to exercise that right to be tried that quickly. I think what Fani Willis is doing here is, A, she's making a statement, and that's perfectly appropriate to say, we're ready on everybody, and B, she's trying to get clarity from the judge. How many trials will there be, and when will they be?
Jennifer, do you agree? What do you think the strategy is here by Fani Willis?
I do agree. I mean, there's no way 19 people can be tried together logistically, even if they were all ready, which of course, as Elie suggested, they will not agree to be, nor should they. I think it's actually foolish of the two of them to want a trial in 2 months. So I think Fani Willis just wants to get a date certain on the calendar for the 17 others, which is also another group she'll have to thin down before trial, because even 17 is just not going to happen logistically.
So this federal judge is deciding, the federal judge rather, who is deciding whether to move Mark Meadows' case to federal court, is now requesting additional briefs about Georgia's RICO law, which is at the center of this case. Elie, does this suggest anything to you about how the judge may ultimately rule?
It suggests to me that the judge is right on the fence here and close to making a decision. And it's a really interesting issue because the determining factor as to whether Mark Meadows and eventually perhaps Donald Trump gets the case over to federal court is, were they acting within the scope of their official federal jobs or outside the scope? And what the judge is asking here is he's saying, okay, these defendants are charged with racketeering. The racketeering is comprised of dozens of different acts. And the judge is asking, if I find that some of those acts were within Meadows' job, but others were outside of the job. Is that enough? And the answer, by the way, Alex, is we don't know. This specific question has never been addressed by statute, by a case. And so I think the judge wants to assess the strength of the arguments. He knows he's going to be appealed either way. And I think he's trying to get it right here.
And to that point, during his testimony yesterday, Mark Meadows claimed that his actions were all undertaken as part of those official duties, as part of his role as White House Chief of Staff. Jennifer, I want to get your reaction to what Mark Short, the Chief of Staff to the former Vice President Mike Pence, told me about Meadows' argument. We spoke just yesterday. Take a listen.
Then why was he circumventing all of White House counsel's advice? Why wasn't Pat Cipollone involved? Why wasn't that team involved? Why wasn't DOJ involved? Instead, Mark recruited outside lawyers who he wanted to listen to. And so I think that undercuts the notion that this was all part of my federal responsibility if I'm not getting counsel from the people who are hired into your office to serve the White House in that role.
Jennifer, what do you make of that argument?
I agree. I mean, there are kind of two rebuttal arguments here. That's one of them, just a factual issue. You know, he wasn't actually doing the job. He was going outside of it. And then, you know, there's a legal issue as well. So I think that the judge is just going to have to sort through all of this and decide whether he was acting within the scope or whether he overstepped the bounds. And, you know, I think there are facially decent arguments on both sides, but ultimately the better arguments are on the prosecutor side here.
Ellie, what did you make of what Mark Short told me?
I think it was a good point by Mark Short. You know, it's one thing for Mark Meadows to say just sort of generally what I was doing was within the scope of being chief of staff. But when he was confronted on the stand yesterday with specific phone calls, specific statements, it got a lot harder to defend. Now, Mark Meadows has taken a sort of interesting position here. He's saying the chief of staff is a unique job in our federal government because it's properly both federal governmental and political. I don't know that the judge is going to buy that, but it's going to be, like we said, a novel issue of law and I think a close call by the judge here.
All right, Ellie Honig, Jennifer Rogers, certainly a fascinating few days and months ahead. Very interesting to see when and how all of these trials are going to fit together.